In a move that Biden officials describe as the most ambitious plan ever to cut planet warming emissions from passenger vehicles, it rolled out new regulations on car emissions Wednesday. The Environmental Protection Agency's new rules claim to curb or aim to curb carbon emissions and boost the sale of electric vehicles and hybrids. But these new rules relax the initial tailpipe limits proposed just last year.
The latest directive comes as sales of EVs have slowed, according to the auto industry. The slowdown could spell disaster for President Biden's pledge that half of all new cars on our roads will be zero emission by 2030. This latest move is central to the president's strategy to combat climate change. And of course, the GOP is not thrilled about this. And you can count me as someone who's not thrilled either. I think this is a terrible idea. This is basically an EV mandate without the term mandate. They're trying to make it functionally impossible for car companies to create new vehicles that are gas powered, that match these emission standards or fall below them. So they're basically requiring car companies to make the bulk of their new vehicles electric. And this is going to be devastating for the auto industry. I'm shocked that UAW President Shawn Fain has come out in support of this. Because Ford is one American company that has already scaled back production of EVs because the demand for it in the American market is simply not there. And there's also the issue of electric vehicles not requiring as much labor to create as a gas-powered vehicle. So not only do you not get the jobs replaced at the same number when you start transitioning to EV production, but you also have the problem that the skills that people have in creating gas-powered vehicles aren't always one-to-one transferable to the production of EVs. So I think this is going to have a devastating effect on union workers in the auto industry.
Yeah, I think, Shawn Fain's a fighter. I think he'll probably end up landing a contract where there's a promise of workplace training where jobs aren't transferable and a promise of reduction in cuts. These companies can create a lot of different models of electric vehicles. I think, the way to move forward with the auto industry is to make sure that you don't have consumers or workers bearing the burden of this transition from fossil fuel to something more renewable, whether it's electric vehicles or otherwise. In this case, it seems like it's going in the way of EVs altogether. It doesn't seem like we're getting much investment in public transportation like many people hoped for. But I think at the end of the day, what we're really seeing here is a failure to have the burden, fall on the people who profited the most from a negative externality, a business with a lot of negative externalities. When you have oil companies profiting year over year tremendously, when you have the auto industry profiting year over year tremendously, and you have consumers struggling to make ends meet, it costs around $12,000 a year to just have a vehicle. Many people need them for work. That's a huge expense to have. At the end of the day, I think if there's going to be any kind of punishment, it's got to be some kind of Pigovian tax on the people who initially reaped the benefits of something that did pollute the planet and did cause global warming. And there are a lot of profits gained by people in the oil industry and by people in the auto industry who don't seem to be the main people having the negative impacts of a policy change here to ensure that we have more renewable energy. And I just don't think it's something that should be a burden borne by the workers. What we should really see going forward is more carrot policies and less stick policies to get us where we need to be economically.
It seems really unfortunate that a lot of the auto industry in the United States is finally starting to revive after years of really, really tough going. Detroit, for example, in Michigan is one city that's finally starting to see a little bit of a renewal, and it seems like this is going to push it in the opposite direction. I think the other problem that I have with this regulation and the economy shift, or the attempt by Biden to force the economy to shift to electric vehicles as the only type of vehicles Americans are allowed to drive, is that there's not any evidence that electric vehicles are better for the environment. They refer to them as zero emission, but it's not really true. I mean, sure, they don't emit fumes into the air when they're driving around, but the production of EVs requires significantly more fossil fuel use than the production of gas-powered vehicles. You have the mining of the rare earth minerals for the batteries that is incredibly environmentally unfriendly and also poses a national security risk to the United States because a lot of those mines in Africa are controlled by China and also require child slave labor, which is obviously another area of misfortune. And then with charging the EVs, our charging stations are powered by fossil fuels. Our electric grid is powered by fossil fuels. So until they figure out some way to change the fact that the production process and the charging process are actually worse for the environment than the production process for gas-powered vehicles, it seems like this whole myth that EVs are better for the environment is just going to continue, and we're not really changing anything. We're not really affecting anything in terms of climate change if that's really what our goal is.
We've also seen, similar statistics come out about producing wind turbines, that the emissions put out by just manufacturing them and shipping them around the world has been, in some cases, a situation where there's more negative results than positive benefits. There's more emissions created by the shipping and the production than are saved by relying on wind energy. We are going to need, to expend some degree of fossil fuel-based energy in order to move towards a renewable future. But I think this isn't going to happen. This transition isn't going to happen unless we focus a lot on the oil industry, unless we focus on transitioning the energy sector of our economy more towards renewables. There needs to be more incentives for the people who produce energy, for the people in America, to produce it in a way that is clean, and do that without there being a cost burden on the consumers of gasoline right now. And the reason, I would say, is why we're not taking that route is because fossil fuels in the pockets of all of our elected officials. When we look at lobbying year over year and we see how much money elected officials are taking, it's pretty obvious why the burden is not falling on the fossil fuel giants. And it's because not only are members of Congress shareholders in some of the biggest oil companies, which shouldn't be allowed. It's like allowing athletes to bet on games they play in. But also you have this corrupt interest or a conflict of interest, rather, it is corruption, that you have elected officials being paid directly by oil companies to do the exact opposite of what's necessary for our economy and for our society. And workers and regular people who are consumers of cars and gasoline are the ones that are getting the short end of the stick because we don't have billions of dollars to give to our elected officials to represent us better.
I hear your concerns about the lobbying industry. I share them, but I think there's a much more functional reason why these so-called renewable energy sources are not gaining as much ground and are requiring massive government subsidies for them to be sustainable. And it's because energy basically needs three things in order to be efficient and effective. They need to be cheap, they need to be reliable, and they need to be abundant. And the only energy source that hits all three of those is fossil fuels. I mean, you brought up the concern with the wind farms, and I've talked about the production of EVs creating a lot of pollution and issues in that regard. Wind farms are also super harmful for the environment because they really disrupt the patterns of fishing. You have whales washing up on the beach in New Jersey because they've been messed up. Their internal rhythms are messed up by these offshore wind farms. And just recently, there was a coal plant down in the south. I forget exactly which state it was in, but they were supposed to shut down the coal plant. But in building an electric vehicle battery factory, they discovered that they needed to keep that entire coal plant open just to be able to source the energy for that EV battery factory. So if they had just avoided, bringing in the EV battery factory, they could have closed down this coal plant and apparently gotten closer to their climate goals. But because these EV batteries require so much energy to create, they had to keep the coal plant open just for that. So this all seems so counterproductive to me. I would also point out that another major problem with electric vehicles is that it's going to take a long time for the roadways to have the proper amount of charging stations for this to be a reliable source of charging, a reliable source of transportation for working class Americans who typically have longer commutes because they live in rural parts of the country and they need to, for example, go into the city to work. Right now, an EV is not really a feasible option for them because of the lack of charging stations, and also just the fact that the cars as they're made right now don't give you as much mileage as a gas vehicle with one charge. It also takes like 40 minutes to an hour to charge at one of these charging stations. So if you don't have a garage in your house where you're able to have a charging station at home, it's very difficult for people to justify having an EV because they're afraid that they're going to get stranded. And we also saw just a couple of weeks ago, a lot of major utility companies in the United States were warning that they're getting very close to capacity on the power grid because the demand for electricity is so high. So if you add in all of these EVs to that market, all of a sudden you're basically tapped out of your potential energy sources. I mean, California was sort of the perfect example where they announced that they wanted to transition their market to all EVs over the next 10 years. And then a couple of days later, you had Gavin Newsom telling people not to charge their EVs for a few days because of power shortages and rolling blackouts. So I just don't think the U.S. economy, the U.S. infrastructure, the power grid is anywhere near where it needs to be if Biden wants to hit this goal of having half of cars be EVs by 2032. It seems like this is something that's just going to hurt the auto industry, hurt the consumer for really not much benefit.
Can you say those 3 or 4 things that you said oil or fossil fuels have that other energy sources don't have, that they're cheap, accessible? What were they?
Cheap, reliable, and abundant.
Yeah, I think, there definitely was a period of time where I believe that to be true for the oil industry. And then after Spindletop, we've really seen it become more expensive and more dangerous for the environment to extract oil. And what we've seen from the oil companies is that when we really need to increase production, they're unwilling to do so because what Wall Street's doing is promising returns to shareholders. They're promising dividends. They're saying we're going to be extracting the oil at X rate. So what they're doing is intentionally making American oil scarce so that prices can be higher and they can increase the longevity of their oil extraction so that there's consistent returns to shareholders over time. What I think would be best for the American people if rather they increased oil production in the United States and made oil cheaper. They're unwilling, though, to sacrifice their astronomical profit margins. It's really about them getting rich at the expense of the American worker, raising prices on gas simply because they can. That's a bad economic incentive for our economy. We want energy to be affordable so that we can be more productive. But I think we also want it to be safe. We don't want creating energy and burning up fossil fuels to be something that jeopardizes our survival on the planet. The projections about famine, floods, and storms, it's going to be far more expensive to move your entire family, your entire home, and deal with rebuilding communities after some of these major storms that will result of the increasing temperatures of the planet, than it will be actually to transition to renewable energy. And so it seems that the profit incentive goes in the opposite direction of what's best for society, which is a common problem we have in America and around the world. But there's a solution that the government could pursue. They could say, we're going to invest a lot in public transportation so that we save the money in the long run. We're going to invest a lot in making sure that EVs are more easy to use for those who need to use them so that they can drive them for longer and fulfill their needs to get from A to B. And instead, what we have is not a lot of investment in public transportation. And it really does seem like the consumer's bearing the burden here, really when they should not be, because the incentives are really going in the other way for these executives that are making decisions thinking of their shareholders more, than the American people that rely on their fuel to do their day-to-day lives and keep food on the shelves.
I think you're right that oil companies are scaling back production or limiting production, but I would argue that maybe the underlying reason for that is more about uncertainty for the future of their industry as they face these regulations from the Biden administration. We're going to dig into this more next time. More Rising after this.